Joe Waxman, and I am here with Alex Jack. Now, Alex has been, I think everyone knows Alex has written tons of books alongside with Michio, been involved with the Kushi Institute, and has done a tremendous amount within macrobotics. So, Alex, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Joe. I guess you could say under the circumstances, under the pandemic, which we're all living under, the modern plague, so to speak. So thank you for inviting me this morning.
Thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. It's my honor and my pleasure to have you to interview and speak with you. And so, Alex, why don't you tell us how it all began for you within your macrobiotic journey?
All right. Yeah, usually when people ask me how I begin, I actually have a very interesting story that begins in 1967 when I was a little bit younger and a little bit more handsome, and I was a reporter in Vietnam during the war. And I was stationed in Saigon, in the capital, and I'd been traveling around the country reporting, not so much as a military reporter, though I did interview the military, but I sought out different people and cultures, you might say. In fact, I got very involved with the Buddhist community in Vietnam. Most of the people in Vietnam are Buddhist. In fact, most of them were not siding with either of the two major parties, so to speak, in the war, which were the United States, which was backing the South Vietnamese government, which is a very dictatorial regime made up of military generals and Air Force pilots. And then the other side was the communist-led National Liberation Front, which was basically a group of people who wanted a social revolution and were being supported by Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese at that time. And so the whole war was in many ways a proxy for the Cold War between East and West, between America and the Soviet Union. Anyway, I went to Vietnam as a journalist and lived in Saigon and traveled around interviewing many different people. And at one point I got involved with some young people my own age. At that time I was in my early 20s. And they were involved in the Buddhist underground. And through them I was able to arrange an interview with the head of the Buddhist movement in Vietnam. And his name was Thich Tri Quan. He was a Zen master. And at that time, he was taking refuge, asylum, in a large pagoda in Cholan, which is a Chinese sister city of Saigon. And I went to see him, and I was quite surprised because the pagoda, it was a large pagoda in this large city, and it was ringed by tanks from the South Vietnamese army and police, and they had cordoned it off, and they wouldn't let anybody in or out. And because I was a journalist and I had credentials from the United States government and the Pentagon, I was allowed inside. I was virtually the only one. So I went inside to meet with him because he had sought sanctuary in the pagoda because he was a marked man for the government. They wanted to kill him because he had led street demonstrations in Hue, which was the holy city of Vietnam, up toward the DMZ area. And this was in, I think, the year before. He had led these peace demonstrations, and they had been violently suppressed by the South Vietnamese Army and Air Force with the support of the United States government, and 4,000 people had been killed. And then he had fled to Saigon. And again, street demonstrations had broken out, and actually several governments had fallen because of that. But he was untouchable because the government knew that if they killed him, the whole city would erupt, and they would burn down the presidential palace, and so there was a standoff, and the government would not go in and actually kill him because they didn't want that kind of violent eruption, but they wanted to limit his activities. So they simply created this cordon around him. Nobody could go in or out, though I was the exception. Anyway, I went into the pagoda and met with him. And my first impression of this Vietnamese monk was that he was the most radiant person I'd ever seen in my whole life. He was actually just glowing with energy. And his face, his countenance, he was about, I would say, in his early 40s at that time. And totally charismatic. And I'd been around a lot of kind of bright people. I'd spent a year in India studying Hinduism and Buddhism. And I'd met a lot of gurus and, that kind of thing. But he was way beyond anyone I'd ever met in terms of just the brightness and the aura and the energy coming out of him. So he invited me into what he was using as a little office there, and we had some tea, and I sat down, and I can't really remember if our conversation was in English. I don't know. It might have been in French because I had rather poor high school type French. And that was kind of one of the mediums. It was the earlier colonial language of Vietnam was French. Or it may have been that we had an interpreter, or he may have had poor English. I really don't remember. But anyway, we conversed for about an hour, and we had a usual kind of what you might call journalistic interview in which we talked about the war and its effect on the country and on Buddhists in particular and on society and this and that. And I had actually uncovered a whole wards of children who had been napalmed, and been severely injured by napalm and white phosphorus. And I don't know, it was just horrible cover-ups were taking place throughout the country during that time that I was able to find. And so we were talking about that. And then at one point, he says, "Tell me also, Alex, where have you been recently?" And I said, "Well, I've been on an aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is where the United States was bombing Hanoi and Haiphong. And I'd gone out to interview the pilots. And in the course of my being on the aircraft carrier, some of the pilots had disclosed to me that they had nuclear weapons on board. And this was totally provocative because Southeast Asia was supposed to be nuclear free. And so I mentioned this to the Zen master. I said, they had nuclear weapons on board. And I said, aren't you afraid, that this could lead to nuclear war? And he said, well, through the Buddhist underground, we've heard similar reports from North Vietnam, from Hanoi, that the Russians, the Soviets, had brought in nuclear weapons to match the Americans, in case one side or the other launches. And so I said, yeah, but couldn't this lead to nuclear war through miscalculation or through some crazy pilot, right, on one side or the other, or computer accident, because these are all, even at that era, they had computer systems at that time. And he said, and so I was really concerned that this was where everything was leading. And he looked at me and he says, Alex, there's something far worse than nuclear war. And it was at that point that the room kind of disappeared. And I felt almost like a disembodied spirit because I could not conceive of anything worse than nuclear war. I'd grown up in the 1950s as a child and the early 60s, with the Kennedys and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the height of the Cold War, and everybody knew that the world could be destroyed in literally an hour, with thermonuclear missiles, and that would be the end of it, World War III. And the idea that there was something worse than nuclear war, it didn't compute when he said that to me. And so he was sitting there, looking very glowing and enlightened. And I said, I beg your pardon, what is worse than nuclear war? And his answer was equally mysterious. He said, his reply was the rice. That was his reply, the rice. I had no clue what he was talking about. And I said, I beg your pardon, the rice. What do you mean? And he looked at me with his penetrating gaze. And he says, Alice, you got to understand that rice is our staff of life. It's our main food in Southeast Asia. And for thousands of years, rice has been the foundation of society. And he went into this kind of mini lecture in which he explained that food was not just physical food. He says it's the whole basis of culture and spirituality. And he talked about how it creates social values and morality and ethics, and how it's integral to the family and society and art and religion. And it was amazing because I never connected this before. And even though I was vegetarian, I'd become vegetarian in India. So I had some food consciousness, but it was mostly ethical, right? Not how its effects on animals and on the environment to some extent. But I never connected it with society or with spirituality before. So he's talking about all this. And then I said, well, what does this have to do with things now? And he says, because of the war, because of the bombings, because of the defoliation and the chemicals that have been dropped in our country.
Agent Orange.
Agent Orange. He said, for the first time in the history of my people, we can no longer feed ourselves. We can no longer, for the most part, the rice has been destroyed. So he says, in this situation, he says, we are now eating rice from your country. It's being brought in from America. It's being airlifted or shipped. And what he says, that rice that you're now giving us has no life. That's the way he called it. He said, has no life. And I said, what do you mean? And by that, he explained, he says, it's polished white rice. It's from your president's country. And by that, he meant Lyndon Johnson's Texas. He was the president because Kennedy had been killed. And he became president, and he was elected in 1964. And he came from Texas, which was the biggest rice producing state in the United States. And so all the rice that was coming over to Vietnam was white rice. And was replacing, I wouldn't say necessarily they were eating totally brown rice, but it was certainly not 100% polished. Throughout Asia, historically, they actually polished rice to some extent. It could be 10%, 20%. Sometimes it was complete 100% brown rice. But anyway, it was typically somewhat very lightly milled, not 100% like American rice. See? So he said that rice is not alive. It has no life. And he says, this marks the end of our culture and civilization. It's much worse than the bombs. See? And I said, but a nuclear war, don't, how can that be worse than he said, well, he says, if nuclear war comes out of Vietnam or wherever, he says, yes, it'll kill your country, America, it'll kill Russia, it'll kill Europe, it'll kill Japan. In other words, all the industrialized world will be extinguished. But he says, we're a small, tiny, decentralized little country here in South Vietnam. So even though radiation will come, some of us will survive. And so we'll be able to continue, but we have to have proper food, see. And so he said, that's what, he says, I actually spend my nights worrying about is the food supply, not so much nuclear weapons. So that was totally amazing to me, that kind of teaching, totally macrobiotic teaching. And so it was a couple of years later after I returned. I was living in Boston, and I was involved when I got back into the peace movement and anti-war activities. But I was vegetarian, as I said, and so I was eating often at the macrobiotic restaurants in Boston, Seventh Inn and Sinai, and I was reading East-West Journal, and actually I was not impressed by the macrobiotic people that I had encountered during that time. I thought they were all totally fanatics because they were all wearing three-piece suits and imitating each other, right down to the way he held his cigarette. And so those people didn't impress me at all. But the restaurants, and I was shopping at Erewhon, and I was reading macrobiotic books. I think what was that? Michelle Albacera's little cookbook. And so I was kind of macrobiotic in that sense. And then I actually, my first course was a shiatsu course that I took. And I didn't realize that the teacher was macrobiotic. I was just interested in learning a little bit about, Oriental healing and shiatsu. I think if I'd known he was macrobiotic, I wouldn't have signed up. But anyway, it turned out that he was macrobiotic, and during the shiatsu classes, he would introduce home remedies and talk about macrobiotic philosophy, and it wasn't so crazy after all. And that then led me to take a seminar by Micho. And Micho was, of course, totally sane, I guess you'd have to say, and common sense. In fact, he was giving a lecture on world affairs and politics, and in his lecture he talked about food and society almost exactly the same way as the Zen master had in Vietnam. Exactly the same message, basically. And Micho was always so much more reasonable than his students, and it's like the phrase "more Catholic than the Pope," that applies to fanatics, I think, in any movement. Sure. The leaders are actually quite grounded and down to earth in most cases, but their followers become very zealous and fanatic.
Yeah.
And so that was certainly true in the early macrobiotic community. But anyway, from there, I continued studying with Micho after that first seminar. And I think it was in 1975. I'd actually just gotten married, and I had moved from Boston to Marblehead, which was a small, beautiful little seaport city north of Boston on the Atlantic, very historic city. And anyway, I started working at the East-West Journal, which at that time was located in South Boston. That was the macrobiotic monthly magazine. And so I would commute by bus from Marblehead, which was about, 30, 40 minutes north of Boston, and come to, the bus went into, I think it was called Haymarket, which was the actual food market, outdoor food market in Boston. And then I would just walk about about a mile or 2/3 of a mile to the Erewhon warehouse, one floor, which was occupied by East West Journal. So that was kind of my macrobiotic beginnings.
Really good story, Alex. I particularly love the influence of Zen and spirituality, and because I've come across that myself, and sometimes I think we're some people lack that perspective within macrobiotics and only look towards the nutritional side of things, and I think it can get lopsided when you do that. So personally, I love the influence of the spirituality within reference to macrobiotics, because I think that is a very important connection um, to make and to keep making. Um, can you talk about that more, the spiritual side of food as it relates to macrobiotics?
A little bit, yeah. Like we can talk a little bit about Zen. For example, there was a Zen master named Dogen, who was
Yes.
a medieval Japanese Buddhist monk. And it was interesting because he was searching for the truth, as most seekers do, or whatever their religion might be. And as I recall, I think he had a dream in which he was told to look at a certain Buddhist sutra, and they didn't have the proper copy in Japan, so he had to go to China in order to get this scripture. And he went and he found the monastery and the teacher and so forth, and he learned that particular Zen. It was a Zen tradition, and but the most interesting thing was that on one occasion he was traveling within China, and he was on a boat, and on the boat he met another Zen Buddhist practitioner, and they got to talking. He was an older man, and he asked him what he did at the monastery, and he said he was what they call a tenzo, which was a cook at the monastery. And so they got to talking, and Dogen, who was a kind of a young student, said, "Well, why after 30 or 40 years of Zen practice are you still in the kitchen? Don't you want to be, working with the sutras or transcribing or out giving public lectures or doing zazen, sitting meditation or whatever it might be?" And the man just laughed at him. And because he could see that Dogen could see that he was, quite a kind of enlightened type of person. And the man just said, "Young visitor from abroad," he says, "you don't have the faintest idea, what Zen is." Mm. He says, it was like it begins in the kitchen.
Thank you. Yes.
And so then when Dogen went back to wherever he was studying there in China, then he learned what was called Shojin Ryori, which was the art of spiritual cooking. And so when he came back to Japan, he introduced this traditional art of, which again was the foundation really of Zen. It was a cuisine-based cooking, very balanced-based cooking of whole grain, brown rice, miso soup, and very simple, balancing foods like that. So that became the foundation of this particular school of Zen. There were others, but that was the one that Dogen practiced. So I think that's been an influence, within the modern macrobiotic community to some extent, with Micho and George Osawa and others. Yeah.
I think it's important to keep that alive and remember it and make it an active a part of macrobiotics, because without that, I think macrobiotics can easily delve into nutrition and not much more than that. Um, so I, for one, definitely appreciate that. And I just want to add one thing that in my studies of Advaita Vedanta, Ramana Maharshi said that food awareness is the highest yoga for spiritual attainment. So there's that similarity there. And he didn't go into that much detail, but he did recommend a sattvic diet, which means peaceful food, vegetarian food. So very similar there. I just wanted to add that I'm a firm supporter of the spirituality, the energetic side of macrobiotics, and I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So, Alex, what are some of the events that led you up to your work with the Kushi Institute and everything else with Michio and all that? What are some of the key things that you can talk about with that?
Well, as I said, after studying with Micho, then I started working at East West Journal. And I was at the Journal for 7 years and worked my way up to editor-in-chief of East West Journal. And then after that, I started working directly with Micho and Aveline, writing books. So for the next, I don't know, maybe 10 years, I was working full-time on different books like Cancer Prevention Diet or Diet for a Strong Heart, Aveline's cookbook. Anyway, we did one big book after another. And then they asked me to serve as the director of the Kushi Institute in Beckett, which had opened the second campus. The original campus was in Boston. And then in the early 80s, they bought the property out in the Berkshires. Mm-hmm. And so we opened a second campus there. And so I moved out to the Berkshires, and it was the end of the 1980s. And so I think it was about 3 years then that I was directing the Institute. And then we set up what was called the One Peaceful World Society, which was kind of a friendship or membership society with little chapters all around the world. And we had a newsletter. And we published many books, not only through major publishers, but we started our own little press called One Peaceful World Press. Mm-hmm. And so I stepped aside from managing the Institute to run the society, though I was still teaching at the KI. And so continued to live in the Berkshires for the next, from the end of the 80s actually to the present time, but I was involved with the Institute pretty much on and off during that period. Though I spent about 5 years in Europe in the early 2000s, based primarily in the Netherlands, working at the Kushi Institute of Europe with Vika and Adalbert Nelson, who were the founders there, and teaching throughout Europe and doing many activities there. And then I, back here in the States, in the Berkshires, Micho asked me to return to the Kushi Institute. I think it was in 2013. So I returned to manage the Institute over the last period until he passed away. And then we were able to keep the school open for another couple years. And then for a variety of reasons, then it closed down. And but since then, our core faculty, we've been operating under the aegis of Planetary Health, which was a nonprofit that we actually started in the year 2000. And originally we started Planetary Health. We had a campaign called the Amber Waves campaign, in which the idea was actually, it goes back to the to the Zen master was to protect rice in the United States, which at that time was being threatened by Monsanto.
Uh-huh.
They literally were about to introduce GMO rice in California, Sacramento Valley, where most of our brown rice comes from. And it was a done deal as far as they were concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went out and with Edward Esco, and we went out to the Sacramento Valley, and we met with the Lundbergs and other rice farmers, and we said, we've got to stop this. And
Yeah.
so we organized a campaign. We did petitions, we did lectures, we did teach-ins. It was a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to our amazement, we were successful. We
Yeah.
got a lot of other environmental groups and health groups and so forth. And Monsanto went down to defeat. They never were able to release GMO rice.
Fantastic.
It
Thank
was
you.
good, yeah. And we did the same thing actually with wheat. Monsanto was about to release GMO wheat. This is a cool story. So Ed and I, we went to Washington, D.C., and we met with, that time was called, I think, U.S. Wheat Associates, which is the #1 trade group for wheat in the United States. They handle all of the export of wheat. And they were very concerned because they knew that if GMO wheat was introduced in the United States, that many foreign countries wouldn't buy any wheat because they were afraid of contamination.
Mm-hmm.
And so we met with them, and they said, there's a summit meeting coming up of all of the wheat growers in the United States, and Monsanto's going to make its final pitch for GMO wheat. And they said, we have no real scientific information about, what effects will come. They says, can you provide us, kind of a white paper that we can present with the scientific information, because it's coming up, the end of the month. So we went home and we wrote up this huge, as much information we could get about GMOs as applied to wheat. And so we sent them this very well documented thing, which they took to their summit. And we heard back, they said it was amazing because we presented this, we gave out copies, and all the other wheat growers started raising questions. And in the end, they outvoted Monsanto. They refused to go with the wheat. And again,
Right.
Monsanto was just about to do that. So that killed basically rice and wheat in the United States. It has never, ever been resurrected. And I don't want to brag, but, knock on wood, because, they keep coming back, with new versions and new strains and this and that. But anyway, for 20 years, there's been, no GMO wheat or rice in the United States and around the world. So that's been great.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. That's excellent. Really wonderful.
Yeah, so again, that shows the power, really, macrobiotics, but also, and in my experience, it literally takes a handful of people to affect social change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you get 4 or 5 people who are totally committed to something. They can create a spark, and just light up the world. And so I think that I can say,
Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, that's what we need now, like with the environmental movement. See.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think everyone, we tend to think that we have no power, and it's exactly the opposite. If we have a little faith in ourselves and risk some vulnerability and risk, being defeated possibly, we can do amazing things. It just takes that courage and that risk and putting ourselves out there and making an effort.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been very impressed with that Swedish girl, the one who started the the campaign against global warming. What is her name? Greta.
Okay.
Maybe you don't think so much of her, but
I think she's a puppet. She's being led by other people, but okay.
yeah, again, I don't know too much on the inside, but, what I liked, at least from my, rather distant vantage point, I like to call it a children's crusade. And it seems to me that at least the little bit of that I followed it, that she started in her hometown. She was the only one, and then she got a few friends. And then, I don't know, it was about a year and a half ago, I think, uh, you know, it had mushroomed to like 1 million children around the world went on strike. And then a year later, 4 million went on strike. And it doesn't take, you don't have to be a math genius to figure out that, within a few years, you're going to get a majority of the huge numbers of children around the world who are going to go on strike. And it turns out that she's vegan. And she hasn't made that an issue yet in terms of global warming. But I think at some point she's going to connect the dots, and that the children are going to go on strike in the schools for better cafeteria food. And then they're going to go on strike at home for better food at home. Anyway.
I doubt it, because I'll tell you why. She's already compromised. They've already got to her. They already control her, and they won't risk their animal food industry. They're on the side of the animal food. That's my view. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic.
That's a whole other, I don't know the ins and outs of that. But anyway, again, from a little bit of a loftier perspective, at least that's the trajectory that I saw. So we'll see. But anyway, but it shows how one person, though, can make a huge difference.
One person can make a huge difference, and we all can. And I think everyone should speak out and speak their heart and speak get their voice out there. So, Alex, I already I interviewed Ed, and I know you worked closely with Ed for a long time, still do. So, what are some of the? He mentioned some of the more recent projects you guys are working on together. Why don't you talk about some of that?
Yeah, I can tell you one of the current projects that we're doing is what we're calling a Whole Foods Plant-Based Diabetes Project. Mm-hmm. And this is an interesting story too, because we've been in the Berkshires, now doing macrobiotics for 25 or 30 years easily. Mm-hmm. And as you can imagine, the relation with the medical community during this time has been up and down. We've had a lot of individual support from individual physicians over the years, but you might say institutionally, there tends to be not a whole lot of support. But a couple of years ago, we decided that we wanted to do a macrobiotic diabetes project in which we would take type 2 diabetes patients and give them macrobiotic food, for a relatively short time, and then measure the improvement in their health. And because our experience is that diabetes improvement comes pretty rapidly in a matter of weeks in most cases. It's a lot easier to show the benefit than with cancer patients, for example. And as you know, a lot of the macrobiotic orientation over the years has been dealing with cancer simply because nobody else had any clue of what to do. Mm-hmm. But it's not an easy disease to cure. And it takes a long time, for the results to come in and this and that. Whereas diabetes is pretty straightforward. And all of the major medical groups already know that it has a dietary foundation. But showing that it can be actually recovered from has not been as easy as showing that it can be prevented. In any event, we put together a proposal, and in order to do this kind of medical study, you really have to get the support of a hospital or medical group in order to recruit patients. So we went to what's called the Berkshire Medical Center, which actually is a huge hospital here in the Berkshires in Pittsfield. It has 4,800 employees, so you can see how big it is. It's the biggest employer in the whole western part of the state. And, you know, it was kind of a lark for us because we didn't think, you know, that they would approve it, but we had actually made friends with one of their physicians who had come to our summer conference and who liked us a lot and who was giving lectures on the microbiome and this and that. And he said not only would he support us, but he would be the lead investigator, the senior consultant. So we put together a proposal and we went to see what's called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, which is made up of about 20 senior doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators, because they have to weigh in and approve on any medical studies that are proposed. Mm-hmm. So we met with them in one of their conference rooms, myself, and then a third member of our group, Bettina Zumdek, longtime macrobiotic teacher. Mm-hmm. And so we thought there'd be, you know, this grilling that they would, you know, the Q&A session that they would really make us do our homework and cite chapter and verse and everything. And we were pleasantly surprised because all of their questions were softball type of questions. Hmm. And they were all enthusiastic about our study. Hmm. And times have changed. It was amazing. Yeah. In fact, one or two of the nurses, you know, after they looked at it, they raised their hand. They said, "Can we join? Can we join? You know, we're pretty diabetic." Nice. So anyway, we got the permission of this group. They gave us the green light, which was amazing. So that allowed us, you know, in other words, they were going to refer their patients to us for the study.
Wow.
So, but then the COVID came along, and so we haven't been able to actually start it, but we've been doing fundraising, and we're, I don't know, 2/3 of the way right now to raising funds for the study. It's a relatively modest study as studies go. Mm-hmm. It was only $25,000. So, you know, we've raised now, I think, about 15. Mm-hmm. I think we'll probably be able to get the rest, you know, within the next few months, because we couldn't even start it until the COVID is subsided. So that might be in possibly the spring of next year. But the interesting thing, I think, is, as you probably know, and many of your listeners, watchers may know, is that COVID, that 80% of everybody, mortality from COVID is from people with pre-existing conditions. Right. Diabetes is one of the major ones. So if we can prevent diabetes or relieve diabetes, you know, we're going to also be able to help with new viral diseases. Mm. So there's a direct connection between that. So that's one of our most exciting projects.
That sounds very promising. It seems like you could get really good results from that.
I think so. We're very hopeful because, you know, the success rate is, I don't know, 75 or 80% with people with this kind of condition. Yeah.
So what else is there? I know you have the summer conference coming up. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to talk about that or if you want to mention any other projects you got going on right now.
Yeah, well, I'll just mention in passing, yes, we do the annual summer conference. And after the Kushi Institute closed here in the Berkshires, we've been holding a conference at a place called Eastover, which is a holistic resort in Lenox, which is very high end and actually a very lovely setting and environment and kind of a first class accommodations and everything. So it's been a little bit like night and day in terms of the facilities from the Kushi Institute to hold it at Eastover. And they've been very welcoming to us. But this year, of course, because of the pandemic, we've had to move it online. So our conference will be starting next Wednesday through Sunday. And we've got a lovely conference lined up with about 15 senior teachers, including some junior teachers, younger teachers. But anyway, it's a wonderful conference. And I think we have 6 cooking classes. And then the other ones will be people like Tom Monte and Denny Waxman, um, Virginia Harper, and every year we give an award. We call it the Michio Peace Prize to someone for their lifetime contribution to macrobiotics. And this year we're honoring Lino and Jane Stanchich, who are longtime teachers and counselors, and also Michael Potter, who's the president and founder of Eden Foods, who's the largest macrobiotic company in the United States. So we'll be giving that prize. And then I'll just mention my own topic. I'll be lecturing on the spiral of history, which is one of the major macrobiotic kind of templates or teachings. And but quite apart from my lecture, that's been the main focus of my own work for the last several years. Actually, since Michio passed away, because we did a lot of work on that when he was alive. And the last edition of the One Peaceful World book, we brought up the spiral of history up to date. But since then, I'm doing an expanded version book on the spiral of history. And because it's coming up, I mean, it ends basically in 2036.
Yeah, I mean, if you could talk about that, because I feel like we're witnessing the spiral of history right now. I mean,
yeah, I mean, yeah, essentially, the spiral of history refers to the last 5,000 years of human history. I mean, before that, we call prehistory. But the historical development is actually spiraling into a climax from the ancient world to the medieval world to the modern world. The tip of the modern world we call the digital world. And it's all coiling in on itself. And again, I don't like to use precise dates, but it does correlate to some extent with 9 star key cycles. And roughly 2030s to 2040s, this whole historical arc will come to a climax. It doesn't mean life will end, but it means that this particular huge historical cycle will reach some kind of a resolution, and then it will begin to transition into a new spiral going in the opposite direction. There'll be actually an 81-year period of transition from the 2030s till the early 2100s. But the point is that the current crises that we are facing, including global warming and climate change, including COVID and new viral epidemics, including artificial electromagnetic radiation, including nuclear war and cyber war. And in other words, all of these converging threats are coming to a head right now. And we've got to find a way to pass safely through this crisis and get to the other side. And if we can get to the other side in the 2030s and 40s, then we can reconstruct society in a more healthy direction. And so anyway, that's what I've been focusing on is passing through the spiral. And I'll tell you very briefly, one of the great exciting discoveries that I made was that actually there have been, in human history, there have been several major civilizations that were entirely peaceful and harmonious, that existed for 1,000 years or more. And for the most part, you don't read about them in the history books.
Like Atlantis and Lemuria.
No. Those are mythological civilizations. They may or may not have existed. Okay.
What are the ones you're referring to then?
I'm talking about historical civilizations that we know for a fact existed. I mean, I love to read about Atlantis and, that kind of stuff, but it's out there, or in there, whatever you want to say. It's not scientifically or historically been verified.
Well, there's some evidence pointing to Atlantis, but anyway, go on.
Yeah, there's some evidence, but again, there's consensus is, again, it's a theory or it's that kind of thing. But in terms of real historical civilizations, there are at least 5, and actually there are probably several others, The first one is the Minoan civilization in ancient Crete and the Aegean Islands that preceded Greece. And it was a totally peaceful civilization. They controlled maritime commerce in the Mediterranean. They traded with Egypt and many other places. And archaeologists have found there's no evidence of any warfare, any offensive weapons, any fortifications. And the whole society is really mysterious because there's a lot of artifacts. And they had a egalitarian culture and society. They had cities with paved roads, with indoor plumbing, hot water and cold water. I mean, they were really advanced society. And this 2 years ago, I went to a little island in the Aegean called Santorini, which was the hub for this civilization. It was the most amazing experience in my life because I walked through the ruins of the ancient city that has been excavated. You can literally go into the ruins and walk through them. And totally macrobiotic culture and civilization. You could feel it, and you could see the evidence. It was a barley-based culture. That was their main grain. And the artwork and the cookware, everything had a macrobiotic feeling to it. Totally different from Greece, which was a patriarchal, warlike culture. So you go back to Athens or anywhere in Greece, and I like Greece a lot, but it was totally violent society in comparison to the Minoans. Anyway, that was the first one. The second one is called the Indus Valley Civilization in India, in northwest Pakistan and North India. And again, there's all kind of ruins there, and archaeologists have found that it lasted almost 2,500 years. No evidence of war or violent deaths. Totally peaceful. And again, barley was their main grain. And this is very different from Vedic society, which is, the foundation of Hinduism and Buddhism, which was, again, like Greece, it was totally warlike. Anyway, those were two of them. And then the third of the peaceful societies was in West Africa. It's called the Niger River Valley Civilization on the Niger River. And it also lasted for over 1,000 years. And this is interesting because their main grain was brown rice. And their secondary main grain was millet. And they had advanced metallurgy. They were iron makers. But guess what they used their iron for?
Cooking?
Cookware.
Yeah.
Farm utensils. They had no warfare, no weapons, nothing.
Interesting.
And also guess what? Also like the Minoans and like the Indus Valley Civilization, West Africa, there's no sign of monarchy or government. It was all voluntary associations. No central administration, no priest, no religion, no temples. Totally amazing, all based on nature. All the art is naturalistic in all these three societies.
So if they weren't constructing weapons, that it would be safe to say they were not hunters, so they were just farmers.
No, they were predominantly farmers, though they had hunting weapons.
Okay.
They had hunting, but it was a tiny part of the traditional diet was plant-based for sure, but they had a small, tiny amount of animal food, more like condimental use.
Right.
In all those societies. Same thing in ancestral Australia, the so-called Aborigines. Again, they were peaceful society. They were actually the longest. They go back to 65,000 years ago. Way longer than anybody else. And then the fifth one is actually the earliest civilization in the Americas. It's called Norte Chico It's located in northern Peru, and it was very ancestral, like to the Incans. And this culture was discovered only about 20 or 30 years ago. And the excavations, again, show totally peaceful culture. Their main grain was quinoa, and again, no evidence of warfare, for 50 generations or more. I mean, amazing, totally amazing. But then later on, we come up to more recent historical times, you get the Incas, who are totally violent, very different. So, but
So
anyway.
we're running close to the end of the time, but I want to ask you one quick question about that. What do you think was the main differentiating factor between more warlike cultures and the more peaceful ones? Because most of them, as far as I know, did eat grain essentially because animals run away from you. Grain doesn't. Grain can support life, and so all the civilizations that were stable had grain. Some were more warlike, some weren't. So.
Yeah, of course, the diet was foundational, but one of the big differences is that these 5 cultures all had on grains. In other words, the grains that had the long, the long spiky awns, those long filaments. Whereas historically, the warlike cultures were all based on grains, but they were predominantly awnless grains. The awns, they had. See, when you have monoculture, and as opposed to wild grains, when you domesticate grains, for the most part, the awnless grains, when they take off the antenna, see, which give you higher intuition. When you take off those antenna, they're easier to harvest. So that's why in Asia, throughout Asia, you have awnless rice in China, Japan, and other places. They've eaten that for thousands of years. So they lack the higher spirituality that comes from the on grains. Barley, interestingly, and wheat, they have a different chemical structure than rice. So historically, barley and wheat, even today, are mostly on. So you get higher intuition from eating barley and wheat, whereas from ordinary rice, it's good for your health, but for spiritual development, not so great. It's very interesting. This is a huge
First time I've heard of this, Alex. I'm going to have to think about that one for a while.
Okay, yeah, it's something that Ed Bettina and I have been doing for the last 3 years. Also, Christian Elwell at his farm, he's been growing the on rice. He's got the old strains.
But wheat civilizations generally develop more materialism because of the high protein content. This is my understanding.
To some extent, yeah, they're very practical and down to earth, and there's a scientific mentality. Anyway, it's a topic for another discussion.
Right, we don't have time to fully cover it, but that is an interesting point, and I will have to think about that one.
Yeah.
So I want to wrap it up here. I want to say a few words to finish, and I'll let you say a few words after that. As always, I have my website, themacrobioticdiet.com, where you can check out my blogs, book an appointment with me. My mom is having a class coming up this Saturday, August 15th at 10 a.m. Not tomorrow, next Saturday. What is family unity? So sign up for that. It'll be really good for people to hear what she has to say. And that's it for me. Alex, what final words do you have for us?
Well, I enjoyed being on your program, Joe. Thank you so much, and wish you and your listeners well, and hope to see you again, either on your show or one of our activities at Eastover and so forth.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. This was really interesting, and I loved hearing all the stories and your perspective about things. So, great.
Okay, take care.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.